Hello everyone, and welcome to CRAMSURG, Clinical Research Appraisal and Methodology for Surgical Trainees, where we pick a paper fresh from the press on a hot general surgical topic. We review it for you, we present it for you, we critique its methodology for you, and provide top-of-the-field expert opinion and teaching on research appraisal and methodology. My name is Gio Perrin, and together with Professor Sababala Subramanian and Maria Digby, we bring you CRAMSURG from the wonderful region of the Yorkshire and the Humber. Welcome back, everyone. For this episode, we are gonna have a look at a paper that comes from the CODA collaborative, and particularly looking at the parallel cohort study they conducted concomitantly to their randomized control trial comparing antibiotics versus surgery for acute appendicitis. This will not be followed by formal teaching sessions, so this episode is slightly shorter, but we'll have some good critical appraisal point about the paper itself to compensate. I'll leave you to it.
Lovely. So me and Gio have worked together, and we're going to be talking through what is an observational study published in JAMA in May, about 3 weeks ago now, by the CODA collaborative. So that was 25 US hospitals who did a comparison of outcomes of antibiotic drugs versus appendicectomy for appendicitis. Which has, I think, Gio says, previously been discussed. And we thought it was very relevant given the kind of recent COVID harem publications as well. So I'll let Gio talk you through the background and the aims a bit more.
Beautiful. So, well, as I'm sure you've all come across, a variety of randomized controlled trials and also now observational studies have been conducted comparing antibiotics versus appendicectomy, and pretty much everyone nowadays, when consenting a patient for appendicectomy, should really mention the possibility of treating this with antibiotics and the related success rate. RCTs have been criticized for potentially selection bias, selecting a subspecific population, and obviously conducting these experiments in tightly controlled conditions. So the validity of those findings might not be replicable. Now, we do know from COVID harem, which we discussed back in episode 22, that there is some real life evidence that antibiotics actually do work with similar outcomes compared to what the RCTs have reported. But in this context, the CODA group have decided to conduct a parallel cohort study to the randomized control trial. The aim of this paper is to compare the characteristics and outcomes of participants enrolled in CODA versus patients that self-selected their own treatment and decided to participate in this cohort study. So I'll pass the ball back to Sophie for a bit more about this study.
So as Gio mentioned, this was a parallel cohort study run at the same time as the randomized control trial, but this was an observational study. Participants were gathered from 23 out of the 25 hospitals involved in the CODA trial. And that was just because 2 of the hospitals, they had collected patients after the parallel cohort study had already begun, and therefore to ensure that there was contemporaneous recruitment, those 2 centres were excluded. The patients that were reviewed were all over the age of 18 with imaging confirmed appendicitis from the emergency department, and they covered a period of May 2016 to February 2020. So patients were then offered either entry into the randomized control trial or offered a self-selection, and then categorized further into subgroups where they were either offered 24 hours of IV antibiotics followed by a 10-day course or an appendicectomy. And the study was designed to have a fixed number of patients within the self-selection subgroups, just to ensure that they were truly contemporaneous with the randomized control trial. I'll pass you back to Gio for the outcomes.
Beautiful. So the outcomes the authors picked for this particular cohort study are pretty much identical to the one they use in the actual CODA RCT. So patients were contacted at 24 hours, 1 to 4 weeks, 3 and then 3 monthly for 1 year, and 18 months, and following that yearly, asking them the EQ5D questionnaire, EQ5D, we've discussed this before. It's employed in a variety of studies, and it's a quality of life related measure. It's self-reported. It's multidimensional, as you can see from the wonderful diagram that Sophie has put for us in this slide. The primary outcome of this particular cohort is EQ5D at 4 weeks, but obviously the authors report this particular questionnaire at all time points I mentioned earlier on. A variety of secondary outcomes are included, including severe and adverse events associated with antibiotics use or complications of the appendicectomy itself, and a variety of other healthcare-related outcomes, such as healthcare utilization, a need for surgery, and need for further courses of antibiotics, days lost from work or school, and general healthcare utilization measures. I'll pass the ball back to Sophie for a bit more about the results.
Yeah, so in total, there was 5,115 patients whose notes were reviewed. During this time period, 1,552 were enrolled into the randomized control trial. However, as previously discussed, 2 of those hospital centres were excluded, so there was 1,094 of those patients included for this paper comparison. 2,953 either refused participation or were not offered randomization or trial, and that was then 510 patients recruited to the observational study, and in that there was 257 who chose to be treated with antibiotics and 253 who opted for appendicectomy. So Gia is just going to talk a bit more about the breakdown of characteristics between those groups.
Yeah, so this table is a reasonably brief summary of a variety of characteristics of the various cohorts included. As you can see, age is relatively similar throughout the board, as well as a sort of gender distribution throughout the 2 cohorts. Minor differences, but pretty much as you would expect. There are some socioeconomic differences that are worth mentioning here, particularly related to education. That tend to be, as you can see, slightly more students in the self-selection group. And there are a few economic-related, health economics-related differences. People in the self-selection group tend to have a commercial insurance. They tend to have slightly less concerns associated with financial consequences of their health choices, particularly in relationship to antibiotics versus surgery. And they also tend to have less Medicaid use. So, ball back to you, Sophie, for a bit more.
Lovely. So then looking at the outcomes, so this is a table taken from the paper itself, looking at comparison between the self-selection and RCT subgroups. The primary outcome, which as we mentioned, was the EQ5D quality of life measures. They found that grossly equal between all of the subsets, whether it was randomized controlled trial, self-selection, antibiotics, or appendicectomy, and similar as well in terms of resolution of symptoms by 30 days, which was one of their secondary outcomes, although it was slightly less percentage of people who self-selected for appendicectomy. 66% said that their symptoms had resolved. One of the major differences that we did pick up reading through the paper, and that the authors picked up themselves as well, was that there is a difference in terms of a hospital utilization and healthcare utilization between the subsets of patients who were treated with antibiotics, in that 26% of the RCT subgroup required hospitalization through the initial 90-day period after index treatment, compared to only 11% of the self-selected cohort who'd been treated with antibiotics. And we were, when we looked at this, we were curious as to why, if that's genuinely to do with the antibiotics or to do with the patient characteristics, why is that also not reflected in the other outcome measures? But Gio's going to talk a little bit more about that when we move on to the limitations.
Yeah, a bit more about the results. So this is quite interesting, and particularly if we look at the chart on the top left of this slide. As you can see, the cumulative incidence of appendicectomy between the self-selection antibiotic cohort and the patients that were randomized to antibiotics in the RCT is quite different, and this persists throughout time after the initial treatment. It's very unclear to me why there would be such difference, and as you can see, if you look at the numerical outcomes on the right-hand side, this is quite evident both at 30 days and at 1 year. Repeated courses of antibiotics also seem to be more common in the RCT arm rather than the self-selection arm. So more antibiotics is not the reason why these patients are getting less appendicectomies. And finally, in the self-selection cohort, there seems to be almost 3 times as many negative appendicectomies. So whenever you put the appendix under a microscope and actually look at microscopic signs of inflammation, a lot of those appendicectomies are negative, which again, we can't really fully understand why, but we'll talk about this later on. Ball back to you, Sophie, for a bit more.
Yeah, so in terms of the limitations that the authors self-reported, they did comment that the exclusion of the of 2 of the centres which had been involved in the CODA RCT may have led to some potential selection bias, although not fully clear. And also the underlying participant characteristics, although certain ones were compared, it may be that there's a difference between those people who are choosing to take part in a randomized controlled trial compared to those patients who decided that they would happily self-select treatment but still be part of an observational study. They also commented that there is relatively small subgroups once you get down to some of the adverse events and conditions which prevented some analysis. And one of the things that they did also comment on is that although they'd hypothesized there was potentially differences between the 2 groups in terms of characteristics, they didn't actually predetermine what would be meaningful or significant in terms of the levels of those differences.
A few more things that we kind of thought about as we were reading through this paper. So obviously we're talking about patients here that are compared to each other but are enrolled in 2 different studies. A group of patients is enrolled in a randomized controlled trial, and a group of patients is enrolled in an observational cohort study. Whenever patients are enrolled on an RCT, physicians kind of feel, if you like, the pressure of adhering to a particular protocol, or in any case, they might alter the way they approach care because of patients being enrolled in a randomized controlled trial. I'm not sure that same degree of halo effect would apply to the cohort that was self-selecting to treatment. So there might be some differences there. Having read both the original CODA publication in the New England Journal of Medicine and this paper, I'm struggling to fully identify whether there were radiological interpretation differences between the self-selection group and the RCT group, meaning did patients that were enrolled in the RCT group had a higher level of imaging review, therefore affecting selection, therefore reducing the negative appendicectomy rate? And does that explain the healthcare user differences, and does that explain the higher negative appendicectomy rate that is observed in the self-selection group? I'm not sure. Again, I can't really fully work it out, having read both papers. And finally, as Sophie hinted at reading through the paper, we struggle to reconcile how there is no difference in primary outcome throughout the board between patients in the randomized controlled trial group and patients that self-selected to antibiotics and patients that self-selected to appendicectomy, when there is a clear-cut difference throughout the board in terms of healthcare utilization after initial encounter. So patients that are treated on the RCT use more healthcare than patients that are self-select treatment. I don't understand how almost twofold difference cannot translate in a quality of life questionnaire difference. And that makes me think that either there are differences between the groups that we are not picking up, or that the primary outcome that they've chosen is not adequate to pick up differences. And that does obviously have repercussion in terms of the original CODA trial as well. But these are just thoughts, obviously, because no one will ever really know. The author justified that difference, saying that patients that self-select tend to have a stronger belief that the treatment that they've chosen will work for them, therefore they will use healthcare less. And again, I don't see why that wouldn't also reflect into quality of life questionnaire, but again, these are just considerations. So ball back to you, Sophie, for some conclusions.
So despite those kind of few limitations we've discussed, overall, the similarities between the characteristics, the primary outcomes, and the analysis that they performed suggest that actually the self-selected cohort supports the findings of the randomized control trial, and that the findings from the RCT trial should be generalizable to a much wider population. And we've just got a table there of some of the positives and more negatives of the paper that we've already discussed. So if anyone's got anything else that they'd like to share or any questions, I'll open up the floor.
A few points that we discussed after presenting the paper, as usual. First of all, we wondered how the authors conducted the selection for patients that were included in the cohort study. We do understand, based on the paper itself, that the number of patients included was limited by predetermined number and quarter-by-quarter recruitment. However, it is unclear how this selection actually happened. And this does have a lot of repercussion, not just in terms of selection of patients included, but also because predetermining the number of patients included precludes us from understanding what's the real life distribution of the self-selection. That is to say, we cannot really say how many people in real life would actually choose antibiotics and how many would actually choose operative treatment. This would be quite relevant information in terms of healthcare planning and help us determine actual applicability of the findings to our own experiences. We reiterated some points related to the use of a primary outcome that is subjective. As mentioned in the presentation, we struggle to reconcile how a primary outcome that is purely patient-reported is not somehow affected by a significant difference in healthcare utilization between the two groups. That does have a lot of implications. The authors do try and explain this through a variety of theories, starting from the possibility of the placebo effect. However, we do feel that it is possible that the primary outcome chosen by the authors is just inadequate in picking up a difference in quality of life between the two groups for this particular situation. Again, given the numerical outcomes and given that the direction of such numerical outcomes is pretty consistent throughout the board, it is hard to believe that such a difference in healthcare utilization would not reflect in a difference in quality of life between the two groups. We then moved on to discuss a variety of issues associated with randomized controlled trials, such as the creation of an artificial environment with a significant halo effect, and how in a lot of instances in the past we found how size or the effect detected for a particular intervention on an RCT does not necessarily translate in cohort studies that are conducted after the RCT to validate the findings in real life. And we discussed how this is due to a variety of reasons. We did mention a variety of other criticisms associated with the use of RCTs as our main source of evidence. And we mentioned opinions coming from experts throughout the world, such as Bruce Ramshaw, that sometimes are very critical towards the use of RCTs in healthcare for a variety of reasons. You'll find a link to Dr. Ramshaw's website in the show notes if you're curious about it. Despite all the limitations that are sometimes attached to a randomized controlled trial, we do still feel that RCTs are the base for the highest level of evidence available out there. And their role in clarifying theories emerging from cohort studies affected by a higher degree of selection bias is invaluable. For today, we'll call it a day, and we'll see you next time with a new paper and a new teaching session.
Thank you everyone for tuning in and listening. Until next time, keep running your life with our surgical podcast.